is here to talk about his new book. The book Culture is actually selling it right now outside on the right side door of 104. So if you're interested, please grab a copy, and then Professor Wu will actually be signing it afterwards. So that's always great. Also, if you're interested in CALIA, which is the organization that does antitrust law here, please sign up on your way out. We have a sign-up sheet in the back. Thank you.
All right, well, hi, everybody. Do I have my mic on, or? Is that on now? There we go. All right, hi, everybody. Couldn't be a better place to launch my book, the home institution, Columbia Law. And I got to say, compared to doing a normal book talk, it's kind of just like relaxing to be at home, essentially, with students, you know, where I teach antitrust, obviously. Many of you are in my antitrust class right across the hall. So my talk today is about this book, The Curse of Bigness. I will give you a hint of what the book is about. It's about antitrust revival in our times. It is an effort, I think, to respond to the felt needs of this moment, which I see is characterized by two economic facts in particular that I want to single out. One is a real sustained increase in economic concentration in our economy. Some of you may be familiar with this, some not. This refers to the fact that the economy, both the United States economy and the global economy, are dominated by fewer and fewer companies per industry. So in 75% of industries over the last 20 years, there has been a decrease in the number of competitors, which just means that there are more and more oligopolies and monopolies across the country, across the world. And another, I think, singular fact that no one can deny is the change in inequality. There's been a profound shift of wealth and income to a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. It's measured by a lot of metrics. One example I describe in the book says, you know, 1% of the population, you've seen all this, controls like 28% of income and almost 36% of wealth. So there has been a incredible both concentration economically, but then also shift in inequality. Many economists believe those two trends are related. They believe that the fact you have smaller and smaller numbers of firms which earn higher and higher profits and are better, have more bargaining power over workers, tends to move the proceeds of the economy to a smaller and smaller group. So that is the economic conditions that I'm talking about. And what I believe we need in this country, and frankly in this world right now, is a reboot of an American original, the antitrust laws, invented in this country in the late 19th century to deal with what I think were similar problems at that time, believing that a deconcentrated economy with less firms, with more, you know, fewer monopolies, broken up firms would be better, not only for the economy itself, but also for the conditions of democracy. So that is the thesis of my book. And I want to structure this talk in three parts. I want to talk about, first of all, the last time we thought that antitrust laws were really important, right after World War II. And then I want to return to the first Gilded Age, late 19th century, talk a little bit about that. And then finally end with our times and what I think needs to be done. So let me wander back to a period right after World War II. The Allies had just won the war. And one of the pressing questions, maybe the pressing question at the time, sort of an obvious question, which is, what do we do to prevent fascism from coming back? You know, it had taken a lot of lives, a lot of effort to defeat the fascist powers centered particularly in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I thought, well, we got to do something about that. Now, there are a lot of answers to that question. There's no one answer. The United Nations was founded during that time to try and prevent war. There were specific limits placed on German and Japanese military buildups and so forth. But one thing that I think has been lost was a thinking of that period that tied the economic conditions of Japan and Germany to the rise of fascism, and was concerned that the unregulated, uncontrolled monopolization, particularly the German economy, had led to conditions that were ripe for dictatorship. So one of the things I'm really trying to emphasize in this book is the political side of antitrust. The theory went a little bit, just to get into the history a little more deeply. Germany did not have antitrust laws in the first half of the 20th century. They didn't break up their trusts. And so the economy was dominated both by cartels and by a few monopolies. Three of the most important were the IG Farben chemical company, the Krupp's armament company, and the Siemens infrastructure company. And one of the crucial things that happened, and you might find some parallel in our times around the world, not in the United States, is in the 1930s, Germany went into this terrible economic shock, obviously felt around the world. There was widespread material suffering, and unsurprisingly, the rise of a strong leader who promised national greatness, promised the defeat of enemies, foreign and domestic, sort of sees this mandate of turning Germany into a world power and restoring its lost sort of mythical greatness. And around the world today, we once again have similar populist movements that are response to this sort of widespread economic suffering. And there's a key moment in that history where, because Hitler came to power, but he had a lot of institutions against him. The army wasn't necessarily interested in him. The church wasn't comfortable. But ultimately, it was these monopolies that were in a position to sway, to both fund the Nazi Party and provide enough support for him, that he managed to consolidate his power. And there's a lot of economic studies of this particular period. I'm not saying they were all 100% in agreement with this idea, but they started to understand, first was they started to understand how their interests were served also by the interests of they both were interested in power. They both didn't want democratic accountability of any kinds. And most importantly, because they were so concentrated, they had the power to move things over. So after World War II, the Allies said the first thing we need is a thorough breakup program. And they had a law in Germany that broke every single one of the companies into very small pieces. And they pushed hard to make sure, and when Europe adopted its own competition statute, and also when Germany adopted theirs, one of the goals was political. To make sure that so much private concentrated power is not allowed to arise that it could tip government in different directions, or that it even, could challenge government. And I think this is, without exaggerating, or there's obviously a lot of difference between now and the 30s, I think we face similar problems today. The real worry about fascism is that you'll have a union of private power and public power, both of them unaccountable, and both of them interested in sort of maximizing their particular interests at the expense of the population. And I don't think you need to be an extremist to think that, well, how is it in the United States the U.S. Congress routinely is not that necessarily interested in the median voter, but seems to more generally care about what large interest groups. So how is it that, for example, pharmaceutical drug pricing, which nobody thinks is reasonable, except for the pharmaceutical industry, no one can really defend. How is it that there's somehow people are unable to do anything about it one way or another? I don't want to say we're quite as far as things were in the 30s, but we're seriously in a danger from, I think, concentrated private power of losing some control over the economy. And I want to, or losing some control over this democracy and what directions we go in. Return to the 19th century, part two of the talk. Let's talk about when we very first confronted these problems in the United States, the first Gilded Age. So there's this problem right now. Sometimes we remember the first Gilded Age. Maybe we've seen too many movies, like a lot of really fancy parties and nice houses, and there's obviously some of that. But I want to go back and look at the economic structure and the ideology of that period to understand better the origins and the importance of the antitrust laws. So if you go back to the 19th century, late 19th century, you have at that period a very radical movement to transform the American economy. There was a merger movement, a mass consolidation of American business that resulted in over 2,000 businesses consolidating into less than 100. And there was a new structure for the economy. The economy began to be dominated by the trusts, usually one trust per industry. And the trust is a fancy name for a monopoly. So you had obviously well-known trusts like Standard Oil, which the oil industry. You had a cotton trust, you had a tobacco trust, you had a nail trust, I think it was a pencil trust. There was every single industry, a film trust, which all the films that were made. So this was the new structure. And obviously there was some economic reasons that people preferred trusts. Competition they had felt was had created a lot of problems for them, and there was individuals who, like John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, became incredibly wealthy. But the people of that era preferred to clothe the monopoly movement in somewhat more dignified clothing. They like to say that they were leading a new order, part of a scientific advance in how humanity should live, that they were involved in an evolution from the competition of Adam Smith, which had been fractious and ugly and messy, towards something grander, more beautiful, ruled by a series of giant monopoly corporations in the model of Standard Oil, who were sort of more enlightened. They sometimes said they were evolving as man had evolved from the ape. They believed very powerfully in a process of survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, as applied to business and as applied to humanity. So this is the ideology. So part of this held that the unfit or the weak should be eliminated or should die. Now, the social Darwinist movement, associated sometimes with Herbert Spencer, who the law students will know from the famous Holmes dissent, took this view for everything. Herbert Spencer himself was very opposed to what were called poor laws, so welfare or anything. And he said it's much preferable that the unfit be left to die, that they sort of rid the world of them to make room for what's coming. Rockefeller went further. He sponsored eugenic campaigns to sterilize, as many of you know, sterilize people who were seen to be unfit or ill. And they said basically the same idea in business. Is small business, small farmers, whatever, they were going extinct, and the monopoly was the preferred form. Adam Smith was wrong about competition. It was a bad idea. So that was the movement. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, there was resistance, and the resistance generated the antitrust law. There were, in fact, something close to rebellion. There was the farmers' movement, the Granger movement. There was an antitrust party. There was there was workers' movements, rise socialists, anarchists, and so forth. But the most concrete form and so the origin of the antitrust law, I want to emphasize, is in this resistance to a kind of theology. Actually, at some points it was religious, like a replacement for the humility of Christianity, towards something that worshiped man as a kind of God, a self-created God, looking towards the sun, to cite Spencer, no longer looking down at his feet in obedience, but looking above to master. So, there's a profound resistance to it, a sense that, America was found in a very different set of values. One thing you got to say about this monopolization movement, it produced some impressive companies. There's disputes as to whether they were actually efficient or not. Some of them may have been too big to be efficient, but they certainly said they were produced wealth, particularly for an upper echelon. It was certainly in tension with some of the founding values of the United States. And I'll mention two in particular. The United States had actually always, in theory, been about decentralized power. Federalism was trying to break political power into states and also in the federal government, the three pieces. There was obviously in this anti-monarchy movement some resistance to the idea of unaccountable powers who ruled over everybody. The original Tea Party was actually an anti-monopoly protest against the British tea monopoly. So this was a big break with some of the founding ideals. And another one, it almost seems strange to say this is a founding American value, but this idea of equality. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to the United States in the 1830s, he opened his his observation of the United States with this line, which I'm going to translate from French so I can say whatever I want. He said one of the things I noticed, and one of the novel objects I noticed about the United States was this equality among citizens. He said, there they are, all in the frontier, and they're all like the same. They don't have classes. They don't have this real difference that we have in Europe, where we have the aristocracy and everybody else. I mean, to say that about our country now seems like unrecognizable, frankly. But that was the sense they had, and that was like what people were so proud of, is that this was kind of a classless society, a place where, obviously they were richer and poorer, but roughly they were in the same league, everybody. And the idea of the merger and the monopoly movement was much different. So the antitrust laws were against that. And I want to center on two figures that are in the book who really had a big role in this, both ideologically and as a matter of law enforcement. So Louis Brandeis is one of the greatest. You may, obviously, as law students, you know him because he was a law professor. No, he wasn't a law professor. He was a justice. He wasn't a law professor. He wrote a famous law review on privacy. And, it's sort of seen as one of these people who's famous. But I actually think he's been misremembered. As Louis Brandeis, even though he cared about free speech, and what he cared most about was the economy and the conditions in which it created for the thriving of a democratic and republican character. What he really cared about was what it meant to live day to day in the United States and whether it produced citizens that were worthy of this country's promise, and whether they had the conditions. So, so that for that reason he was interested in free speech and civil liberties, and he didn't like oppression for government. But he thought the most important, the most dangerous, was oppression from private forces. One thing today's libertarians, I think, sometimes mistake is they, I think, rightfully interested in freedom, but somehow they have no sense of private intrusions into freedom, and things like the fact that the conditions of work, particularly if you're an associate at a law firm, have much more to do with your life than sort of theoretical freedoms at the governmental level. I'm not saying government can't also be oppressive, but day-to-day life, Brandeis thought, is really the real freedom you experience has a lot to do with things like infrastructure, your hours of work. Back then there was no limit on hours of work. Actually, now there's no limit either, again, unless you're. He was very concerned that Americans would become a dull people, that they would become employees as opposed to citizens. They would just be toiling away. He once said, in conditions even worse than Negro slavery, as he said. It's like we just went to war to get rid of slavery, and now through oppressive conditions of employment, we're replacing it. So, Brandeis sort of stood for this idea of what the American economy should be in relationship to what kind of democracy you want. And so he was opposed to private concentration of power. And in fact, this book is probably the most inspired by Louis Brandeis and his ideology, which ultimately is inherited by Woodrow Wilson and powers him through the 1912 election. But I want to focus on another figure who is also really critical to this book, and that's President Theodore Roosevelt. who you obviously have heard of, but also may know him as a trust buster. Being law students, you know that we should be learning that, there's law, statutes. The Sherman Act is very strong in its language. It says that monopolization is a felony. It seems like when the economy is covered in monopolies, it seems like that seems important. But law doesn't mean anything unless it's enforced, and unless you have law enforcement with the courage to take on big companies, to undergo the kind of criticism that you will undergo, to take on lawsuits that take years and years and years and might go nowhere. And so Theodore Roosevelt, I think his great contribution to America, there's more than one, but great contribution to the American Republic was his, almost on the moment of assuming power after the assassination, his decision to wage war against the most powerful private and largest private firms in the United States. And he said that he did this for clear reasons to save the democracy. He saw, in times not unlike ours, a rising tide of discontent, a rising tide of popular suffering, economic misery, and a sense of powerlessness in front of corporations and other entities that he saw, if things weren't done, would lead the country either into anarchism or socialism. That there would be, there have been rebellions before, and he thought there would be rebellions again. And he said, it's a duty it doesn't sound crazy, of government to respond to democratic need and restore power. And so he brought these suits. It's, in his private letters, he said, we need to sort of figure out who actually runs this country. I think we need to re-ask that question, frankly, and have that same kind of bravery. So this takes us to our present time. In the 1900s, early 1912s, almost all of the trusts were challenged. Most of them were broken up or conditioned or did something. I think this was an important episode in American history. It's referred to earlier. I think it led the United States down a different path than some of the European countries. Almost all of them, which ended up under dictatorship or totalitarian government when the Great Depression hit. And it leads me to our present time, because I am under I'm not alone in this, but I feel that our antitrust law has wandered too far from its origins, has become too narrowly economic in its focus. In fact, has shriveled, become sort of a shadow of its former self. Over the last 40 years or so, it has increasingly become on the grip of the narrow economic view, which takes the idea of antitrust as primarily about lower prices for consumers. It's forgotten any idea that its broader goals have a political valence. It's forgotten some of the larger harms that are supposed to go on. And as opposed to having its original purpose of trying to fight monopoly, at its worst, the antitrust law sometimes glorifies monopoly. In the hands of Justice Scalia, for instance, in the Trinco opinion, he managed to, in a case around Verizon, which has held its monopoly for over 100 years, say that monopoly is what encourages innovators to seek new business, while Verizon was killing the innovators who were trying to start new business. So the antitrust law has been, in my mind, turned on its ear, and has fallen far from what it should be, and fallen far from the kind of goals it should be endorsing. So in this book, and more publicly, I've been calling for a reboot of the antitrust laws. I can give you more details on how I think it should be done. I believe that across sectors, one of the areas that seems that people are very interested in is high tech. Tech is one of my, the economy, the sector I grew up in. I think we have allowed the tech sector to become too concentrated. People thought it was impossible for Silicon Valley to ever, at one point it was so competitive, new firms all the time. We would never possibly have any kind of large companies or monopolies that lasted any time. Obviously, that's changed. I think we made, I worked in government both for the Federal Trade Commission, one of the enforcers, and for the White House. And I think we made mistakes during the last administration. I think we allowed, for example, we made a lot of mistakes. I don't take blame for all of them. We allowed the airlines to consolidate into just 3 airlines, all of whom feel very comfortable sort of raising their prices and raising their fees on everything while they narrow the seats. Nothing, what are you supposed to do? Fly Sprint or walk? You don't really, Spirit or whatever. You don't really seem to have much you can do about it. They've been narrowed. I mentioned pharmaceuticals before. The pharmaceutical industry is consolidated. And they've also learned that they can raise prices without any accountability at all. I regard this as one of the greatest failures of government. That all this, hubbub about, in the news, 1,000%, Daraprim was raised from $2 to $760 a pill. And, there's a lot of outrage. Congress had a lot of hearings. Nobody has done anything. It's been 5 years, and the industry has learned that you have to have a bunch of hearings, and Congress will say some things, but they won't actually do anything. And, it is a sign to me that we've lost something of this idea that the people control this country. There are so many issues across the board where a majority wants something, and they don't get it. And that's kind of a simple test of a democracy. Like, how many people are in favor of pharmaceutical price gouging? I don't think any. Maybe it's like 5%. It's always, America's always 10% who are, there 10% of people like Congress, for example. There's always some percentage of people who approve of something. So things have wandered back. And to focus just on my closing on some of what we allowed in tech, for example, some of you know Facebook, and somehow over the 2010s we allowed Facebook to buy most of its major competitors. They bought Instagram, which everyone was saying, this is a new company, it's going to unseat them and challenge them. So we bought them for $1 million. WhatsApp came along. They had their very global reach, a sort of threat to compete with Facebook. They bought them for $18 billion. So those are supposed to send alarm bells in Washington, D.C. You're not supposed to be illegal to buy your main competitors. And in fact, that was what Standard Oil did. They just bought all the oil companies and created this giant monopoly. We let it happen with Facebook. And then suddenly, what do you know? There's scandal after scandal of privacy breaches. Who knows if the 2016 election was affected, but it might have been. And I think all partially because they don't face any real competitive pressure. And in fact, even their very size, something you look at, their very size makes them the target, creates its own kind of weakness. Because of that is in some ways the curse of bigness. We've allowed it to become too sensitive, allowed it to be too controlled by too few companies. So I just want to close. Maybe I've sort of made my point by now, I think. But I don't think it's some of you may think, well, there's other ways of getting at this. I want to suggest there's something about antitrust, something about fighting concentration, economic concentration, private power, that gets at the core of a lot of these problems. And let's say you're concerned about inequality. So maybe you want to change the tax code or something. Well, how do you think you're going to change the tax code if you still have so much concentrated private power, whose idea of changing the tax code we've seen in recent times? It means more corporate tax cuts. But, the middle class, if they could lobby, would reduce taxes themselves. They're incapable of it. So the point that I'm trying to make is if we, I think, want to recapture the sense that this republic is responsive to its citizens, we need to be more serious about private power, and we need to be more serious about the problem of concentration, which I think affects our times. We're in serious danger, I believe, at its more extreme, of repeating some of the signature errors of the 20th century, where we tolerated concentration, tolerated inequality. It is, to my mind, not a surprise that we're having political conditions that match the mistakes we made before. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Tim, I'm wondering if I can ask you a question. What are your thoughts on Eric Holder being the president of the Chicken Shit Club in terms of lack of prosecution against corporations? And then the New York Times published about 2 weeks ago an article that the Trump administration was doing less than Obama in terms of giving all these corporations a discount on their corruption charges. And then I'll just leave you with the last thought, and that is, what about breaking up Amazon?
All right. Well, it's not a small number. So actually, I think that despite it being a vulgarity, I think chicken shit club is an important concept. Do you guys know that it's a references to Jim Comey, who used to give this speech to the federal prosecutors at the and he did it like that. Have you guys heard this? I'll show you. He said, "Who here has this is at the SDNY," and so he sat there in front of all the prosecutors in a very proud tradition, a Southern District, and he said, "Who here has never lost a case?" And a great number of the attorneys put up their hands. He said, "You are members of the chicken shit club." Because if you've never lost a case, it means you're not bringing enough cases, or you're not bringing cases that you might lose. And he had a very good point. There has been a cultural drift in prosecution. This is part of what I'm targeting in my book. Towards, it's trans-party, towards this extremely cautious kind of law enforcement. We only bring a case if you have like the perfect case. And, that is obviously not the exact right level of whether it's criminal prosecution or whether it's antitrust. And one of the reasons is, the better defended the target is, you're going to end up staying away from those cases because you're afraid of losing. So one of the things that I think is an unfortunate antitrust policy is they essentially have left alone the bigger companies, the bigger industries, but they'll like find two barbershops in Seattle that are agreeing on their price and put those guys in prison. You know what I mean? Because they're easy targets. They're either easy targets, and they want to win cases, and people are afraid to lose cases. So, as law students, we need a new generation, the people with the courage of Theodore Roosevelt, the courage of that comes with good prosecutorial discretion. I'm not saying to go crazy, but this generation that looks at their feet and does not bring hard cases is bad for the development of all of our federal laws. And I'll take some other questions. I'm sorry, I know I didn't answer everything. Yeah.
I was just curious on big tech, continuing with it, what are the harms you actually feel since Amazon, Facebook, and Google are providing free services?
Mm-hmm.
So what element of their power do you think they derive from the vast troves of personal data they've collected on?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think the question is the easiest answer, I think, for Facebook. I think Facebook has hurt competition and hurt innovation in the social media sector, and also had sort of I wouldn't say they're non-economic, but other kind of harms like privacy harms and so forth. So I think because Facebook hasn't had much competition, since they managed to buy all the competitors, they have been able to do a couple things. First of all, they've been able to dial up their privacy abuses with some confidence that no one's going to leave, or not enough people will leave that they'll have to do anything about it. Now some fault may lie with the consumer, but also some fault, if someone's saying, if you have a competitor, they'd say, hey, these guys, they don't protect your privacy, why don't you come here, right? But there isn't really, what are you going to go, Instagram? Instagram's also, so I think that I don't think they've run very reckless, the Russia investigations are starting to show how reckless they were. We're just trying to build their ad revenue. Again, no sort of check, there's no like lift to their Uber, if you want to put it that way, who says, well, here's some of the worst abuses. And if you get into it a little more carefully, it's probably also the case that between Google and Facebook, because they have a duopoly in online ad revenue, that they have jacked the prices in that area for their particular types of advertising. So that's a price harm. I think Amazon and Google are slightly harder cases. I think for some of the reasons you suggested, or that everybody has suggested. But I want to focus in particular on this the state of Silicon Valley as an innovative economy driver of the economy. One of the things that has dried up in recent years is VC funding for any kind of firm that gets anywhere close to any of those areas. And so, if you're a believer that innovation is a huge role in trying to move the economy forward, and if you look at the 80s and 90s, it feels that kind of cycle of new firms starting. That cycle is drying up, and one of the reasons is, I think, is you just have this idea there's 3 or 4 big guys. If you're lucky, you get bought by them, but if you're not, if you're sort of directly competing with this, there's no hope. And I think that the long-term danger, sometimes I'm reminded of the car industry in the 50s, where people are like, General Motors is the most efficient company in the universe. People wrote, there's this famous Harvard business professor who wrote this long case study about how General Motors had solved efficiency forever. And a little like people say about Amazon right now. Like they are just operating at this completely different level of understanding, General Motors, and they were pretty great in the 50s, but you sort of let these big 3 run cars forever. Eventually, you start to see stagnation and, in fact, a generation of suffering and regions of the country that ended up being devastated by the loss. So I'm not a believer in the efficient monopolist over the long term based on its track record. More questions? Yes. My research assistant is asking me a question.
I'm sort of wondering, who are what sort of expertise would guide kind of an originalist political antitrust regime, in the sense that, today economic expertise is a huge influence on case selection and litigation remedy shaping. Under sort of a political system or a partly politically focused antitrust regime as you describe, I mean, would we be getting input from sociologists or political theorists as well?
No, I don't see it that way. I think it's lawyers, frankly. I think there's a balance of power in antitrust between lawyers and economists, and I think it's swung too far towards the economists. We can all agree with that at the law school. So let me be a little more careful what I think about political motivations for antitrust. What I don't mean, and there's some danger in this, is something like the current chief executive yesterday said that, Comcast needs to be investigated, they're evil, or something like that. In other words, the enemies of the president become targets of antitrust enforcement. That is a dangerous path. But I do think, I actually think Robert Butofsky, who's this famous figure in antitrust, he just died. He said that even though in any individual case the economic concerns are going to be front and foremost, and sort of how you build your case, in the back of your mind, you have the idea that what you're trying to do, and the reason for this law, is ultimately a separation of powers-like thing, right? I mean, there's a constitutional dimension to antitrust where it recognizes that private power can come to equal public power, in some cases exceed it. So in the back of your mind, when you are enforcing these laws, when you're trying to break up monopolies, you have in mind this is also for this background reason of maintaining the separation of powers inside the country. One problem with the Constitution, good document generally, is that when it was framed, they didn't have any conception that there would be this problem of private power. Businesses, there was no corporations. Businesses were small businesses like Benjamin Franklin and these kind of guys. And they had crown monopolies, which they disliked. They didn't have this idea of independent private power that might rise to constitutional levels. And part of what I think we did in the election of 1912, which is described in the book more carefully, was take a new vision of the Constitution that enshrined antitrust and other forms of enforcement as a kind of permanent constitutional check on where private power can go. And I think we have let that lapse and forgotten that understanding of how this economy and this country is supposed to be. Yeah.
Do you think that some of the force of Brandeis's arguments have been taken away by the fact that the real manifestations of workers' subservience that he was concerned with have declined significantly? For instance, workplace injuries, or the fact that real hours worked by non-management employees has declined by 15% since 1950?
Yes, I don't think we're in the situation we were in the 19th century. I mean, let's not exaggerate. Late 19th century makes America look like Sweden or something. People making $1 an hour, $1 a day versus millions of dollars. Worker unrest back first Gilded Age, they had strikes. They actually paid militias to shoot the workers, and it was much more intense. And somehow that seemed to be a fine way of dealing with labor practices. So I think I would not compare exactly, but I think workers and employees have a lot to be angry about. Wages have been stagnant for 40 years. They've gone up a little bit in the last year. And I think that has a lot to do with the relative bargaining power, also decrease in union power. There's a huge rise in part-time work. One of the things Brandeis really cared about, he had this idea, that your work really, something for students here, is that work ends up building your character or destroying your character, who you become. And one thing he felt is he was like, part-time, on and off work, really, if you're constantly anxious about whether you have a job or not, you can't really thrive as a person or flourish. You're kind of always worried about where your next gig is. I think there's some truth to that. Maybe I'm just based on my friends who are freelancers in New York or whatever, but there's some truth to the idea that constant economic anxiety leaves no place for human flourishing. And so I think, a lot of people have been born into an era where they feel very economically insecure. And some of this, I think, translates into very dangerous political directions. People get angry, and blame immigrants, blame foreigners, blame China, whatever. And I think many of the dangers Brandeis talked about are still here. Try and up in the back there.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate in the college. So one thing that we see that's being very different from the Gilded Age is also the issue of price discrimination using big data. And we're seeing threefold differences in prices, like for airlines, for Amazon, whatever the case may be. So how do you propose that Antitrust deal with big data and price discrimination?
It's interesting. Some Antitrust students know this. There's a law that bans most form of price discrimination in the United States, Robinson-Patman Act. But with very trivial exceptions, it hasn't been enforced in like 40 years. Why? People don't like the law. I mean, the prosecutors have basically nullified the law. That's one of the things that has happened. And I think is a good question. I'm actually very concerned about price discrimination for the following reasons. So, I know enough about the economic literature to know that some of the advantages, it leads to more revenue. Everyone knows what price discrimination is, right? Like different prices paid by different people. But one of the things, there's several, actually I'm writing on this, several reasons I think that I think it has harms that we don't fully recognize to live in a perfectly priced society. One is the fact that even though supposedly rich people are supposed to pay more and poor people less, it doesn't always work that way in practice. Because what it is what you can get away with. And what it tends to really punish is the unsavvy, the unaware, sort of the suckers, or some people are less educated or just they're good at getting a good deal. When I was in Stanford, for example, East Palo Alto was much poorer than West, but actually the gas prices were more for whatever reason. The gas prices were higher, and you go to sometimes poor neighborhood, go to a grocery store, the prices actually aren't cheaper. Things are more, and it's just like, well, people, these people won't drive away, so why not? People are not going to not eat food, so why not jack the prices up? And the credit cards that poor people are credit risk, but often they're just a terrible ripoff, huge annual fees, and so a lot of it ends up not so much being the kind of thing you'd hope for, but just a sort of a punishment of certain kinds of people. It also encourages people to spend all day trying to, move categories, and that's its other cost. I also think it starts to break, extreme price discrimination, which has kind of become a part of more and more of everything. You go to Disney World and there's a lineup for fast food people, and so it does start to break that de Tocquevillian sense. We're kind of all in this together, right? Sometimes I prefer just it's kind of a first world problem, but sometimes when I fly Southwest versus flying other airlines, at least you're sort of in it together. You know what I mean? Versus, if you're sort of low status in America, you sit there and you watch everyone else go on. Or, I don't know, it just really turns us against each other. And I think there's more and more stuff that is in this country, and price discrimination is one, like turns us against each other. Very subtle ways. We don't always analyze it, but it's like fast lanes, slow lanes, doors for cheap, just turns each other against each other. And I prefer to live in a country where we're kind of in it together, undergoing, maybe this has to do with growing up in Canada, where it's cold. We're all like suffering with I'm a dual citizen, but suffering with the weather. It's, I think there's something to that in the spirit of the country that we need to return to. I think how much are we doing on time? Maybe one more question. Where is, All right, you were waiting earlier.
Thank you for doing this. So your view, which is the open markets view of attacking private power by breaking it up, is pretty common. But other people, most prominently Senator Liz Warren, have taken the view that instead what should happen is you should get essentially public control over private power.
Yes.
So, for example, the Accountable Capitalism Act, or people talking about. I was curious why you prefer your view to theirs.
Thank you. That's a great question. So it actually goes back to the 1912 election too. I won't get into too much, but there's a big debate among people who are concerned about private power, which is the answer breakups or structural relief, or is the answer to regulate them? So in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt kind of changed and gone in the regulatory direction. First New Deal was very much the regulatory direction. The Brandisian structuralists like me are like, no, let's break it up. And I just do not have a great faith in regulated monopoly. And I'm concerned that, let's take the example of Amazon or Facebook. One of the implications of heavy regulation is entrenchment. So you never get rid of them. And so you have that, 40 years later, like, okay, they're like the utility. You have to think about the future and think about Facebook as being like Con Ed, a bunch of like, I'll turn right wing and say unaccountable quasi-bureaucrat who's like, you're like, hey, why'd you do that to my profile or whatever? And it's still important for some reason to, like, it's how you have to see your family. And I don't know, and I also don't like the union. I mean, I talk about fashion. I don't like close union between government and private power. And actually, Facebook's a good example. So let's say you have a government who decides a government that Facebook needs to heal, right? Obey government. When I was in government, Facebook would come in and talk about how useful they could be to us. They'd be like, we know everybody's faces in the country, so if you're looking for someone, just tell us. Actually, no, they did. They basically, because it was looking for missing children, which everyone would say, well, that is such a great thing. But they also know everybody, so it could also be, well, we're also looking for a criminal, or we're also looking for someone accused of a crime, or we're also looking for someone who's a political opponent, or it becomes worse and worse and worse. And so I guess this is my side where I'm not with the traditional left on this. I'm actually with the older left, the progressives, where I'm much more interested in breaking power than I am in the dangers of a union of public and private power. So thank you for that question. And I'll be outside if you want to see me, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I think all these owners are.